In the dim light of a fading day, Tom sat alone on an old creaky bench in his yard, the kind that groaned under the weight of memories more than his own. At 35, Tom had learned to wear his solitude like a second skin, a necessary armor against the world's unpredictability. His phone, now silent beside him, had delivered the news that shattered the evening's calm. His grandparents, the only semblance of parents he'd ever known, were gone. They had been found lifeless, together in bed in that same small country town where Tom's own story had begun. A story punctuated by the premature loss of his biological parents in a cruel twist of fate and metal. A car accident that left a young Tom orphaned and adrift. His grandparents had been his anchor in those turbulent seas, their home a lighthouse guiding him towards calmer waters. That house, with its peeling paint and the comforting creak of its floorboards, was more than just a structure of wood and nails. It was a repository of his childhood, of laughter and tears, of secrets whispered and promises made. It was also a place of shadows, where unexplained events whispered at the edges of his understanding, urging him to look closer, then chasing him away with an icy breath down his neck. Tom's escape had come in the form of a letter, the university's emblem emblazoned at the top, announcing his acceptance and a scholarship. It was his ticket out, away from the strangeness that seemed to seep from the very walls of his childhood home. He had left with a suitcase and a heart full of conflicting emotions, swearing to return. But life, as it often does, wrote its own narrative. Years passed, marked by sporadic, guilt-ridden phone calls to his grandparents. Each conversation a bridge he couldn't quite cross, weighed down by the heaviness of unspoken fears. Tom's career flourished, his personal life a series of superficial connections, a deliberate choice to keep the world at arm's length. Now, as twilight deepened around him, Tom's mind journeyed back through the years, each memory a flickering ghost in the gathering darkness. Mrs. Williams' voice, frail yet clear, echoed in his head, her words a final verdict on a chapter he thought he had closed. "Tom, they're gone. Found them in bed, just like they were sleeping." Grief knuckled its way into his chest, a sharp reminder of all the missed opportunities, the unfulfilled promises. He should have visited, should have braved the eerie corridors of his past, should have faced whatever it was that lurked in the shadows of his grandparents' home. But he hadn't, and now the chance was gone, dissolved into the ether like mist at dawn. The night wrapped itself around him, a cold embrace as he sat there, lost in a sea of regret. Tom knew what he had to do, what the next chapter of his story demanded. He had to return to that small country town, to the house that held both his happiest memories and his deepest fears. There was something unresolved waiting for him there, something that whispered from the shadows, promising both answers and more questions. With a deep breath, Tom stood up, the decision cementing itself in his heart. It was time to face the past, to walk back into the house that had nurtured him, and perhaps in its own twisted way, had never really let him go. The sun hadn't yet crested the horizon when Tom stirred from a restless sleep, his dreams a tangle of shadowy figures and whispered secrets. With mechanical movements, he packed his bags, each item a tangible link to the life he had built away from the past's haunting embrace. His car, a loyal but unremarkable sedan, seemed to understand the gravity of their journey as he loaded his belongings into its trunk. The drive was a pilgrimage, a return to sacred ground, and the road stretched before him like a ribbon unwinding from the spool of his memories. The journey to his childhood town was a long one, almost 12 hours of asphalt and changing landscapes. Tom found a rhythm in the monotony of the drive, the steady hum of the engine, a soothing balm to his frayed nerves. Gas station stops became waypoints on his journey back in time, each ding of the service bell, a call to remember. He grabbed snacks absently, the taste of artificially flavored chips, and the bitterness of gas station coffee oddly comforting. In these moments of pause, Tom found himself gazing at the vastness of the American landscape, the rolling hills and sprawling fields, a stark contrast to the claustrophobic tangle of his recent dreams. It was during one of these reflective moments that his phone rang, jolting him from his reverie. Emily's name flashed on the screen, a reminder of the life he was momentarily leaving behind. Her voice was a warm touch in the cool air of his car. "Hey, Tom, just checking in. How are you holding up?" Emily's concern was palpable, even through the static of the connection. Tom sighed. "It's been tough, Em. I'm on my way to the house now. It's strange heading back after all this time." Emily's voice softened. "I'm so sorry about your grandparents, Tom. If you need anything, just say the word, okay? I'm here for you." The conversation meandered, a lifeline thrown across the miles. Tom found solace in Emily's words. Her presence a reminder of the world he had left behind, a world that still held some warmth. Then, in a moment as unexpected as a summer storm, Emily's tone shifted. "Tom, there's something I've been meaning to tell you, and I can't hold it back any longer." Tom's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "What is it, Em?" "I love you, Tom. I've loved you for a long time, and I didn't want you to leave without knowing." Emily's confession hung in the air, a new truth in the space between them. The words hit Tom like a wave, leaving him momentarily adrift. His heart, which had been so consumed by grief and memories, now wrestled with this revelation. "Em, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll come back to me. Once you've done what you need to do, come back. We can figure this out together." Emily's voice was a blend of hope and fear. Tom felt a swell of emotions, a complex tapestry of grief, surprise, and a budding realization of his own feelings. "I'll come back, Em. We'll talk then. I promise." As the call ended, Tom felt the weight of Emily's words settle in his chest, a counterbalance to the sorrow of his loss. The road ahead seemed a little less daunting, the journey now not just a return to his past, but a bridge to a possible future. But first, he had to face the house and whatever secrets it held, secrets that had driven him away all those years ago. As the miles rolled by, the scenery outside his window took on a more familiar shape. Each bend in the road a reminder that he was getting closer to confronting the ghosts of his past. The small town of Tom's childhood materialized out of the evening mist like a specter from the past, its familiar streets weaving a tapestry of memories and unspoken tales. The car seemed to navigate on its own, guided by the ghosts of days long gone. Each building, each turn was a reminder of a life once lived, a time capsule of joy and innocence. As he drove past the school with its faded brick facade and the playground that had witnessed his youthful escapades, a pang of nostalgia twisted in his heart. Images of his younger self, carefree and laughing, flickered in his mind's eye. Stark against the backdrop of his current solitude, Tom's thoughts drifted to his grandparents, the pillars of his childhood. He remembered his grandmother's warm smile, the way her eyes crinkled at the edges as she pulled freshly baked cookies from the oven, the sweet aroma filling the house with comfort. His grandfather, a bastion of quiet strength who had taught him to fish, his patient voice echoing across the still waters of the nearby lake. The house stood as he remembered it, a sentinel guarding the secrets of his past. Its windows, though dark, seemed to watch him, as if waiting for his return. Pulling into the driveway, Tom's heart raced with a mixture of dread and longing. As he stepped out of the car, the front door of the neighboring house opened, and Mrs. Williams emerged, her figure slightly stooped with age, but her spirit as vibrant as he remembered. Her eyes, moist with unshed tears, spoke volumes of the grief that had enveloped the small community. "Tommy, my dear boy," she said, her voice trembling with emotion as she approached him. Their embrace was a collision of past and present, her familiar scent, a comforting reminder of simpler times. "I've missed you so much, Mrs. Williams," Tom murmured, the words catching in his throat. "Oh, Tommy, we all missed you," Mrs. Williams replied, pulling back to look at him. "Your grandparents, they were so proud of you. The service was beautiful. So many people came to bid them farewell. This town, it's not been the same without them, without you." Tom felt the weight of her words, each one a reminder of the time lost, the connections severed. "I should have come back sooner," he admitted, the regret evident in his voice. "You're here now, and that's what matters," Mrs. Williams said gently. "Come over for tea later, will you? We have so much to catch up on." Tom nodded. "I'd like that, Mrs. Williams. I just need a bit of time to gather myself." With a tender smile, Mrs. Williams watched him retrieve his bags from the trunk. "Take all the time you need, dear. I'm just across the way when you're ready." As Tom turned towards the house, the front door creaked open, as if the house itself was beckoning him inside. Crossing the threshold, he was enveloped by a silence that was almost tangible, the air heavy with the echoes of laughter and whispers of the past. The house was a mausoleum of memories, each room a chapter of his childhood, preserved in time. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light filtering through the curtains, and for a moment Tom felt as though he had stepped back in time. But beneath the veneer of nostalgia, there was something else, a sense of unease, a whisper of something lurking just beyond the edge of perception. It was the same feeling that had driven him away all those years ago, a fear unexplained and unexplored. The evening was settling in, a blanket of stars slowly unfurling across the sky as Tom stepped into the kitchen of his grandparents' house. The room was steeped in nostalgia, each utensil and dish a relic of countless family dinners and quiet conversations. But tonight, it was just Tom, the whiskey, and the haunting silence of the house. He rummaged through his bag, retrieving a bottle of whiskey, its contents warm from the journey. The refrigerator stood in the corner, a once white giant now yellowed with age. Its freezer compartment, despite being empty, harbored a layer of frost clinging stubbornly to the walls. With a practiced motion, Tom chipped off a piece of ice and dropped it into his glass, the whiskey greeting the intruder with a satisfying clink. Glass in hand, Tom ventured out into the courtyard. The grass was cool underfoot, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the drink. He lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his face in the growing dusk. As he inhaled, the smoke mingled with the aroma of the whiskey, creating a sensory bridge to the past. It was 1995, and Tom was 14 again, full of life and unburdened by the shadows that would later cloud his world. He and his friends, the mischievous red-haired Mike and the introspective Philip, were kings of their small universe. The summer days were endless, a mosaic of adventures and carefree laughter. They would race their bicycles down winding streets, the wind in their hair a symbol of unfettered freedom. The lake, with its clear waters and forbidden allure, was their secret haven, a place where they defied the rules and swam without adult supervision, each stroke a rebellion against the mundane. Evenings were for video games, the glow of the screen a portal to other worlds where they were heroes on epic quests, their laughter and cheers echoing in the cramped room. As the sun dipped below the horizon, their world expanded beyond the confines of daylight. They roamed the town, a trio of shadows flitting through the streets, their footsteps a whisper against the pavement. One night, under a sky littered with stars, Mike's eyes gleamed with a mischievous spark. "Let's have some real fun," he said, a grin splitting his face. "Let's see what happens when we peek into other people's lives, give them a little scare." They set off, a band of merry pranksters, their laughter muffled as they tiptoed from house to house. At each window, they would peer in, faces pressed against the glass, their breath fogging up small patches of the cold surface. With a tap here and a creak there, they sent shivers down the spines of the unsuspecting inhabitants. Tom felt a twinge of unease at the idea, but the excitement in Mike's eyes was infectious. Philip, hesitant at first, was soon swept up in the plan. They moved stealthily from house to house, their shadows merging with the darkness. At each window, they took turns peering in, their hearts racing with a mix of fear and exhilaration. The mundane scenes inside, families eating dinner, people watching TV, became the backdrop to their game. Mike, braver and bolder, escalated their antics. He would knock sharply on the windows, then dart away, his laughter trailing behind him. Philip, caught in the thrill, followed suit, his usual reserve melting away in the night. Tom participated, but with each prank a sense of foreboding grew within him. It was as if they were pulling at a thread in the fabric of their small town, unraveling something they didn't fully understand. Tom, Mike, and Philip approached the edge of town, where the houses were more spaced out and the shadows longer. Their target that night was the Jackson house, a modest two-story dwelling that stood slightly apart from its neighbors, both in distance and in demeanor. The Jackson family was something of an enigma in the small town. Mr. and Mrs. Jackson kept to themselves, their interactions with the community minimal and always tinged with a certain aloofness. Their twin children, Paul and Julie, mirrored their parents' reclusiveness, rarely engaging with their peers at school. As the trio navigated their way through the neatly trimmed shrubbery, the old wooden fence creaking under their weight, a sense of unease settled over them. The house, with its dimly lit windows and quiet facade, seemed to watch them, a silent sentinel. Perched on tiptoe, they peered through the living room window. Mr. Jackson was ensconced on the couch, his attention fixed on the flickering television screen. Mrs. Jackson moved in and out of view, setting plates on the dinner table in preparation for the evening meal. The twins, however, were conspicuously absent, presumably in their bedrooms upstairs. Mike, ever the instigator, leaned in closer to the glass. "Heard some weird stuff about the Jacksons," he whispered, his breath fogging up the pain. "Nobody knows where Mr. Jackson works, and he's always got this odd look about him. Mrs. Jackson's like a ghost, always at home, and the kids, well, they're like shadows, barely there." Tom, feeling a twinge of defensiveness for the family, shook his head. "Come on, Mike. They're just private, that's all. There's nothing wrong with keeping to yourself." Philip, hovering behind, nodded in agreement with Tom. "Yeah, maybe we should just leave them be," he murmured. But his eyes remained fixed on the window, curiosity warring with apprehension. The night air was electric with a sense of forbidden excitement as Mike's hand connected with the Jacksons' window, a sharp, daring rap that shattered the silence. Inside, Mr. Jackson's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes piercing the darkness beyond the glass. Mike, the embodiment of reckless glee, let out a muffled chuckle and bolted, disappearing into the shrubbery. Tom and Philip, their hearts racing, followed suit, a mix of adrenaline and fear propelling them forward. They huddled together in the bushes, their breaths coming out in quick, shallow bursts. The world seemed to hold its breath. The only sound the distant chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves under their tense bodies. Then, like a specter emerging from the shadows, Mr. Jackson's silhouette filled the window. He peered out, his gaze scanning the darkness for the source of the disturbance. Moments later, the porch light snapped on, bathing the yard in a harsh yellow glow. Mr. Jackson stepped out onto the porch, a formidable figure against the light. His voice, when he spoke, was a booming baritone that cut through the night. "I don't know who you are, but if this keeps up, I'll make sure you regret it," he shouted into the darkness, his threat hanging in the air like a warning. Mike, hidden in the bushes, struggled to suppress his laughter, his body shaking with silent mirth. Philip, his eyes wide with anxiety, nudged him sharply, a silent plea for silence. After a tense moment, Mr. Jackson retreated back into the house, the porch light flickering off, plunging the yard back into darkness. Mike, undeterred by the close call, was the first to break the silence. "Let's do it again," he whispered, his eyes alight with the thrill of the chase. Tom felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with a gnawing sense of foreboding. "Mike, we should stop," he hissed. "We're pushing our luck." But Mike was already moving, his figure a ghostly blur as he navigated back towards the house. Philip, caught between loyalty and fear, hesitated only a moment before following. Tom, his mind a whirlwind of excitement and apprehension, found himself trailing behind. The allure of the adventure, the magnetic pull of his friend's daring, overrode his better judgment. As they neared the window again, Tom's heart pounded against his ribcage. He knew they were crossing a line, tempting fate in a game they didn't fully understand. In the hush of the night, the boys huddled near the Jacksons' window, the thrill of their game mingling with a growing sense of unease. Mike peered through the glass, his face a mask of concentration. "It's all clear, no one's here," he whispered back to Tom and Philip, who hovered anxiously behind him. Tom took a cautious glance inside. The room was indeed empty, bathed in the eerie bluish light of the television, casting ghostly shadows against the walls. Philip, his voice tinged with worry, glanced around nervously. "What if Mr. Jackson's waiting for us, lurking around the corner or something?" he murmured, his imagination painting a sinister picture. Mike scoffed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Nah, Mr. Jackson thinks we're long gone, scared off by his big bad threats," he said with a confidence he didn't fully feel. At that moment, Mrs. Jackson entered the living room, her arms cradling a steaming tureen, which she placed carefully on the table. Her voice, muffled by the glass, carried a cheerful note as she called out for the twins to help in the kitchen. Paul and Julie appeared, bounding down the stairs, their laughter a brief, lively interlude in the stillness of the house. They disappeared from view, presumably heading towards the kitchen. The room was empty again, save for the flickering images on the TV screen. Tom, sensing the night's escapade had reached its peak, said, "Guys, maybe we should get out of here." But Mike, his interest piqued by the night's adventures, was reluctant to leave. "Let's wait till they're all back, give them one last knock, and then bolt," he proposed, the mischief in his voice unmistakable. As they stepped back from the window, Mike's attention was drawn to a nearby bush laden with ripe raspberries. "Look, guys, raspberries," he exclaimed, his momentary fear forgotten. The three boys descended on the bush, their earlier tensions momentarily dissolving in the simple pleasure of eating the sweet berries. Philip, his hand full of raspberries, wandered back to the window. Suddenly, Philip's voice, now laced with fear, cut through the night. "Guys, look." "What is that?" His trembling whisper was enough to send a chill down their spines. Mike, his mouth still full of berries, joined him at the window. What is it?" he mumbled, trying to swallow. The night air was thick with an ominous stillness, broken only by the boys' shallow breaths as they peered through the window into the Jacksons' dining room. What they saw next would forever be etched in their memories, a scene so surreal and terrifying that it defied all logic. Philip's voice was a faint whisper, laden with dread. "Guys, what's going on here?" His eyes were fixed on the floor next to the dining table where a trapdoor lay open, an abyssal mouth leading to unknown depths. Before anyone could answer, a bizarre and unsettling sight began to unfold. From the depths of the open hatch, what seemed like branches at first began to emerge, but as the shape ascended, it became horrifyingly clear that it wasn't branches at all. It was a man, or rather something that once might have been a man. His head was replaced by a deer skull, its antlers sprawling in wicked arcs. The sight was so grotesque, so surreal, that for a moment the boys couldn't process what they were seeing. Philip's voice was a strained hiss. "Damn it, what is it?" The terror was evident in his tone, each word laced with horror. The figure was unnaturally tall and thin, its fingers elongated into ghastly claws. It was draped in what looked like tattered rags, but the most unnerving feature was the deer skull, a macabre mask that radiated a malevolent presence. There was something deeply wrong about the creature, an abomination of nature that defied all explanation. Tom, Mike, and Philip stood paralyzed, their minds screaming to flee, yet their bodies refusing to obey. The deer-headed figure approached the table with a deliberate, unnatural grace. It lifted the light of the tureen with its grotesque fingers and poured a mysterious substance into it. The boys watched it in muted horror, unable to look away. After carefully replacing the lid, the creature began to circle the room slowly, its skull cocked as if sniffing the air. Its movements were bizarre, almost ritualistic. Then abruptly the creature stopped, its body jerking into a stance of alertness. In one swift, fluid motion, it turned and retreated to the hatch. It descended back into the darkness, the hatch door closing behind it with a soft, sinister thud. The Jackson family sat down for their evening meal, a picture of suburban normalcy. Mr. Jackson, at the head of the table, was joined by Mrs. Jackson and their children, Paul and Julie. Outside, hidden by the shadows, Tom, Philip, and Mike watched through the window, their curiosity turning into a creeping sense of dread. Mrs. Jackson served the soup, ladling it into bowls with a mother's care. Tom's gut churned with anxiety. "Something's wrong," he murmured, but the words were lost in the night. The boys continued to watch, transfixed. The first sign of trouble was deceptively innocent, a cough from Paul. Julie, ever the caring sister, reached out to pat his back, trying to ease his discomfort. But then, almost like a contagious wave, she too began to cough, her body shaking with each convulsion. The situation escalated quickly. Mr. Jackson stood up, his face etched with concern as he moved to assist his children, but he was soon overtaken by the same spasmodic coughing. Mrs. Jackson joined in the chorus of coughs, her body convulsing uncontrollably. Within moments, the entire family was on the floor, writhing in the grip of some unseen torment. As suddenly as it had started, the coughing ceased, leaving the family motionless, lying in an eerie silence. From his vantage point, Tom could see Mrs. Jackson's eyes wide open, moving frantically in terror. It dawned on him with a chilling clarity. They were not dead. The Jacksons were conscious but rendered immobile, paralyzed in a silent agony. The terror of the situation was magnified by its silence. The family lay there, alive yet trapped within their own bodies, unable to move or cry out for help. The night grew heavier with a sinister presence as the trapdoor in the floor creaked open. The deer-skulled figure emerged again, its presence casting a shadow of dread over the room. Methodically, it began to lift each member of the Jackson family, carrying them one by one into the cellar as it hoisted Mrs. Jackson, her eyes locked with Tom's through the window. The silent scream in her gaze was haunting, a window into the nightmare she was experiencing. A sudden noise shattered the tense silence. Mike's hand slipped, creating a metallic crunch against the windowsill. Panicked, he bolted away into the darkness, his footsteps a rapid echo of fear. The deer-headed figure paused, turning its empty gaze towards the window. Tom and Philip held their breath, frozen in place. After a moment that felt like an eternity, the creature turned away, descending into the hatch with Mrs. Jackson. The hatch closed with a soft thud, sealing the horrific scene from view. Tom finally managed to whisper, "Philip, "We have to get out of here." Philip nodded, his face pale in the moonlight. Without a word, they turned and fled, jumping the fence and disappearing into the safety of the night. As they ran, the image of the Jackson family, conscious yet paralyzed, haunted them. They had witnessed an unspeakable horror, a silent agony that defied explanation. Tom and Philip ran with a desperation fueled by terror, their breath ragged, their hearts pounding. They didn't stop until exhaustion overcame them. In the eerie calm of the night, they found Mike sitting on the ground, his back against a trash can, his face a mask of shock and confusion. "What the hell was that thing?" Mike blurted out, his voice trembling, eyes brimming with unshed tears. But Tom and Philip had no answers. They could only exchange bewildered, frightened glances. That evening, as they tried to make sense of the night's horrors, they could only conjure up one feeble explanation. Maybe Mr. Jackson had gone into the basement, and the family had decided to stage a bizarre act to scare them. It was a thin, almost childish theory, but it was all they had. The desire to investigate further was quashed by their overwhelming fear, and the boys headed to their respective homes, each lost in his thoughts. 3 days after the harrowing night at the Jackson house, the town was abuzz with unsettling news. The Jackson family was missing. While at the local store, Tom overheard a conversation between some of the town's old ladies. Their words sent a chill down his spine. "The house is locked from the inside, food is still on the table," one said. "The TV is still on," added another. The rumors swirling through the streets were wild and varied, but none came close to the terrifying truth the boys knew. The bravest, or perhaps the most foolhardy, among them was Philip. He told his parents everything, every detail of that horrifying night. The police became involved, interviewing each boy in turn. The officers' skepticism was evident in their smirks and laughter. Eventually, Tom, Mike, and Philip were allowed to go home. That evening, Tom faced his grandparents in a stern conversation, the first of its kind. "Tom, we're disappointed," his grandmother began, her voice tinged with a mix of worry and disbelief, telling stories about trapdoors and men with deer skulls for heads. "It's just too much." His grandfather chimed in, his tone stern. "The police checked the Jackson house, Tom. They said there's no trapdoor anywhere in that house. You can't go around making up such frightening tales, especially when a family is missing. It's irresponsible." Tom sat there feeling a mix of frustration and helplessness. How could he make them understand? He had seen the trapdoor and the deer-skulled figure with his own eyes, as had Mike and Philip. But in the face of his grandparents' disbelief and the apparent findings of the police, his story sounded like a figment of an overactive imagination. Lying in bed that night, Tom's mind replayed the events over and over. The terror in Mrs. Jackson's eyes, the sinister figure emerging from the hatch, and now the dismissal of his account as mere fantasy. The contrast between what he knew to be true and what was believed by the adults was maddening. The town, meanwhile, was lost in its own theories and gossip. People spoke in hushed tones about the missing family, conjuring up explanations ranging from the plausible to the outlandish. Yet none came close to the chilling reality that Tom and his friends had witnessed. As Tom lay awake, the burden of the unbelievable truth weighed heavily on him. The real story of what happened in the Jackson house was far more horrifying than anyone else in the town could fathom. But with the police having found no evidence of a trapdoor and his own grandparents doubting his words, Tom felt a deep sense of isolation. In the year following the harrowing incident at the Jackson house, the bond between Tom, Mike, and Philip began to unravel, strained under the weight of the horror they had witnessed. Their conversations grew increasingly superficial, the once strong threads of their friendship fraying and eventually breaking. The shared trauma had driven a wedge between them, each boy coping in his own way, yet equally tormented by the memories. Tom retreated into himself, building walls to shut out the world and the nightmarish images that haunted his dreams. He threw himself into his studies with a feverish intensity, driven by a single goal: to leave his hometown behind. The desire to escape, to start anew somewhere far from the shadows of that night, consumed him. Mike's family moved away a year later, leaving another gap in the tattered remnants of their friendship. Tom barely noticed, so focused was he on his academic pursuits. His goal of a university scholarship became an obsession, a lifeline out of the darkness that enveloped him. Philip, on the other hand, spiraled in the opposite direction. Once a bright and promising student, he became a shadow of his former self, his grades plummeting as he withdrew into a world of silence and darkness. Tom worried about him but kept his distance, fearful that reigniting their friendship would drag him back into the terrifying memories he was desperate to forget. When Tom received the letter of admission and scholarship from the university, it was a beacon of hope, a promise of a new beginning. He clung to it as his lifeline, his ticket out of the town and its ghosts. At the graduation ball, Tom allowed himself a rare moment of happiness. Outside under the night sky, he stood with a warm beer in hand, the distant sound of music and the laughter of his peers a soothing balm. For a moment, he was just a normal graduate, on the cusp of a bright future. Then a familiar voice pierced his reverie. "Tom," Philip called out tentatively. Tom turned, surprised to see him there. The look in Philip's eyes was one of desperation and fear. "I'm sorry, Tom. I have to talk to you," Philip said, his voice shaky. "It's about that night, the night that Jackson's—" Tom cut him off, his voice tinged with irritation. "I don't want to talk about that, Philip. It's in the past." But Philip persisted, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I've been seeing him, Tom, the man with the deer skull. I see him everywhere, in my yard by the lake. He's coming for me, Tom." Tom's patience snapped. "You need help, Philip," he retorted, anger and frustration boiling over. "That night is behind us. It's time to move on, to think about the future." Philip's eyes were filled with an unspeakable fear, a plea for understanding, but Tom couldn't face it. He couldn't allow himself to be pulled back into that nightmare. With a final dismissive gesture, Tom tossed his beer bottle into the grass and walked away, leaving Philip standing alone. The echoes of the past were calling, but Tom refused to listen. He had fought too hard to escape the shadows of that night, and he wouldn't let them ensnare him again. As he walked away from Philip, from the prom, from the memories, Tom felt a hollow victory. 35-year-old Tom sat in the backyard of his grandparents' house, gazing at the starry night sky. The whiskey bottle beside him was half empty, and his mind swirled with a cocktail of guilt and nostalgia. He stood up, feeling the weight of his unresolved past. The chill of the night seemed to seep into his bones as he headed inside to bed. His thoughts were haunted by guilt over his long absence from his grandparents' lives, years marked only by occasional phone calls and unfulfilled promises to visit. Equally heavy on his conscience was the memory of Philip, whom he had rejected in a moment of need. Tom resolved to visit Philip the next day, to offer an apology and perhaps to heal old wounds. The morning brought a mild hangover and a sense of purpose. Tom prepared a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs and coffee, eating in silence as he braced himself for the day ahead. After breakfast, he stepped outside, greeted Mrs. Williams, his grandparents' neighbor, and promised to visit her after lunch. Driving to Philip's house, Tom rolled down the window, letting the warm wind play against his face. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and apprehensions. As he parked in front of the familiar yet changed house, he couldn't help but feel a sense of trepidation. Knocking on the door, Tom waited with bated breath. The door opened, revealing Mrs. Lewis, Philip's mother. Time had etched lines of worry and age into her face, a stark reminder of the years that had passed. "Mrs. Lewis, it's me," Tom White, he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Recognition flickered in her eyes. Tom, yes, I remember you. What brings you here? Tom's question about Philip was met with a response he was not prepared for. Mrs. Lewis's voice broke as she delivered the news that shattered the last remnants of Tom's composure. Philip, he's gone, disappeared 18 years ago, just a month after you left. Tom's heart sank, shock rendering him speechless. Disappeared? He echoed, his voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Lewis nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. We thought he might have run away at first. The police were involved, but nothing. My husband, he took it hard. His health declined, and a year later, he passed away. Tom stepped back, a maelstrom of emotions overwhelming him. He muttered a goodbye and retreated to his car, his mind racing with questions and disbelief. Why hadn't his grandparents mentioned anything during their rare phone conversations? How had he been so oblivious to the pain and suffering of those he once called friends? As he sat in the car, the realization hit him hard. The nightmare of the Jackson house hadn't just haunted their childhood, it had devoured entire lives. Philip's disappearance, the sorrow of his family, the years of silence, they were all echoes of that terrifying night. Tom sat motionless in his car outside Philip's house, his hands clammy and gripping the steering wheel tightly. The revelation of Philip's disappearance 18 years ago weighed heavily on him, a tangible burden that seemed to suffocate the air around. He turned his head and saw Mrs. Lewis still standing on the doorstep, her gaze fixed on him, laden with years of sorrow and unanswered questions. Compelled by a need to make amends, Tom stepped out of the car and approached her. Mrs. Lewis, he began, his voice unsteady. Do you know anything about Mike? Is he around? Mrs. Lewis's eyes seemed to drift to a distant memory before returning to the present. Mike moved back here a few years ago, she replied, her voice soft. He stops by occasionally to check on me. Tom's heart skipped a beat at the mention of Mike's return. Could I get his phone number? He asked, a flicker of hope kindling within him. Mrs. Lewis nodded and disappeared into the house, returning shortly with a small piece of paper. The phone number was written in neat digits, a stark contrast to the chaotic turmoil in Tom's mind. He thanked her and turned to walk back to his car, but Mrs. Lewis's voice stopped him. Tom, she called out, her tone tinged with bitterness. Philip, he worried about the breakup of your friendship until the end. Tom turned back, his heart heavy. Mrs. Lewis continued, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. In his rare moments of openness, he told me how much he missed you. I would hear him crying at night, longing for the bond you boys once had. The words hit Tom like a physical blow. Guilt, regret, and sorrow swirled within him, a maelstrom of emotions that he struggled to contain. He stood there for a moment, lost for words, the weight of Mrs. Lewis's revelation pressing down on him. The thought of Philip, alone and troubled, haunted by the breakdown of their friendship, was almost too much to bear. Without a word, Tom turned away and made his way back to the car. As he drove off, tears welled up in his eyes, blurring his vision. The road ahead seemed to stretch into an uncertain future, a path shrouded in the shadows of the past. Tom navigated through the familiar streets of his hometown, a place now tinged with a haunting blend of nostalgia and sorrow. He wiped the lingering tears from his eyes, his emotions a turbulent mix of grief and determination. Pulling out his phone, he dialed the number Mrs. Lewis had given him, the sheet of paper trembling slightly in his hand. As he parked by the curb, he listened to the monotonous beeps on the phone, each one echoing in the hollow silence of the car. Just when he was about to give up, thinking Mike wouldn't answer, the line clicked alive. Mike, it's me, Tom. Tom White, Tom said, his voice laced with uncertainty. A brief silence stretched on the line before Mike responded. his voice tinged with perplexity. "Tom, how are you, buddy?" There was an unmistakable note of hope in his tone. Tom felt a lump in his throat. "I'm in town," he managed to say. "I wanted to see you." Mike's response was a mix of gladness and apprehension. That's great, Tom. I'm glad to hear from you." Tom's heart lightened slightly at the absence of animosity in Mike's voice. "Where are you living these days?" he asked, eager to bridge the years of silence between them. Mike quickly gave his address, mentioning he was on Palmer Street. "It's not far," he said. "I'll see you soon then." "Yeah, I'll be there in 10 minutes, Tom replied, the conversation drawing to a close. With a sense of urgency, Tom pressed the gas pedal, speeding towards Mike's house. As he pulled up to the address, he saw Mike standing on the lawn waiting for him. Tom took a moment to take in the sight of his old friend. Mike had changed. He was more mature, with a hint of stubble and a strong physique. His thick, short-cropped red hair fluttered in the wind, a testament to the passage of time. Tom stepped out of the car and hesitated for a moment, taking in the full sight of his childhood friend. They both had aged. Both had their share of scars from the past, but the connection they once shared was still there, an unspoken bond forged in the fires of shared trauma. Walking over to Mike, Tom felt a surge of emotions. Without a word, they embraced, a simple yet profound gesture that spoke volumes. It was an embrace that acknowledged their shared past, the pain, the loss, and the unspoken understanding of what they had been through. As they pulled apart, there was a sense of solemnity between them. The years had changed them, but the memories of that fateful night remained as vivid as ever. "Thanks for coming, Tom," Mike said, his voice steady but his eyes revealing a depth of emotion. Tom followed Mike into the house, where they were greeted by a pretty girl with long dark hair, cradling a 1-year-old girl in her arms. Mike introduced them with a warmth in his voice. "Meet Tom. This is my wife, Kat, and our daughter, Olivia." Mike affectionately kissed Kat and gently patted Olivia on the head, eliciting a resounding laugh from the little girl. Tom, smiling, said hello to Kat. "And you didn't waste any time," he joked, slightly embarrassed. Mike fetched a bottle of beer from the fridge and handed it to Tom. They moved to the patio, settling into the garden furniture. Tom took a sip of his beer and lit a cigarette, the familiar ritual easing the tension of the reunion. Their conversation flowed naturally. Tom talked about his life after that fateful night, how he went off to university, his career in publishing, and his various failed relationships. He mentioned Emily, the girl he really liked, who had confessed her love to him on his drive back to town. "Maybe things are finally looking up for me," he mused. Mike shared his own journey, moving away with his parents, trying to build a career, and the nostalgia for home that never left him. Meeting Kat, building a life together for 10 years, and then the decision to return to their hometown. "Kat supported me through it all," Mike said, his voice filled with gratitude. "And then, a little over a year ago, Olivia came into our lives." As they reminisced, the conversation inevitably turned to Philip. Tom's expression darkened, and the atmosphere grew somber. "I've been thinking about that night, the night that Jacksons disappeared," Tom began, his voice hesitant. "Our last meeting with Philip, he said he saw a man with a deer skull instead of a head." Tom's voice trembled as he recounted how he had rejected Philip's pleas for help despite his obvious need. Mike listened intently, his expression growing increasingly serious. After a long silence, he finished his beer and looked at Tom straight in the eyes. "Tom, buddy," he began, his voice low, "I see that horned thing too. It's been coming and standing under my house windows for a week now." The revelation hit Tom like a physical blow, a cold shiver running down his spine. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at Mike, his eyes reflecting a mix of terror and disbelief. "You mean you can actually see it?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Mike nodded, his face etched with worry as he recounted his experience. "A week ago, I was driving past your grandparents' house late at night," he began, his voice heavy. "I felt the car pulling to the side. Thought I had a flat tire." He described how he stopped to check and found the tire deflated. After changing it, he stood by the car to stretch his stiff neck. "That's when I saw it," Mike said, a shiver running down his spine. "On the roof of your grandparents' house, a dark horned silhouette creeping across and then disappearing into the chimney." Tom's breath caught in his throat. The imagery was all too familiar, dredging up memories he had fought hard to suppress. Mike continued, his voice strained. "I drove away, trying to convince myself it was just fatigue, a trick of the mind. But I couldn't shake off the feeling." His expression darkened as he shared the most chilling part. "That same night, I woke up, went to the kitchen for water, and there it was, standing in the yard. The man with the deer skull for a head, just outside the window." Tom felt a cold dread settling over him, the nightmare they thought they had escaped now resurfacing with a vengeance. "In horror, I grabbed my hunting carbine from the pantry, but when I got back to the window, it was gone," Mike said, his eyes haunted. He looked directly at Tom, his voice low and serious. "I think that thing, that creature, he was looking for you, Tom, and I think it's responsible for your grandparents' death. But now, it's coming for me too." Mike's fear was palpable as he spoke of his concern for Kat and Olivia. The thought of his family being in danger from this unearthly creature was almost too much to bear. Tom sat in stunned silence, his mind racing. The horror they had experienced as teenagers had never really left them. It lingered in the shadows, biding its time, and now it had returned, more menacing than ever. In the fading light of the day, Kat stepped out into the yard, breaking the heavy atmosphere between Tom and Mike. "Mike, can you help me with Olivia?" she called out gently, her voice a stark contrast to the tension that hung in the air. "Just a minute, honey," Mike responded, his eyes still locked with Tom's. After Kat walked away, Tom and Mike stood up, the silence between them thick with unspoken fears. Tom finally broke the silence, his voice determined. "I don't know what's going on, Mike, but we'll figure it out, and we won't let this thing hurt us or our loved ones." The two men embraced, a silent pact of solidarity against the unknown terror that haunted them. They said their goodbyes, agreeing to meet again the next day. Tom got into his car, the sky now a darkening canvas. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, images of Philip, his grandparents, and the chilling words Mike had shared. The car engine came to life, cutting through his reverie as he drove off. On his way home, he stopped at a supermarket, mechanically picking up some food, his thoughts still echoing with Mike's words. "He was looking for you, Tom." Parking in front of the house, Tom grabbed the bag from the front seat and walked inside. He heated some food in the microwave, grabbed a beer, and made his way to his bedroom on the second floor. The night outside was now complete, a backdrop to his tumultuous thoughts. As he sat on the bed with his plate, there was a sudden knock on the door. Startled, Tom placed the plate on the dresser and went downstairs. Opening the door, he found Mrs. Williams standing there, a plate of cookies in her hands. "These are for you, dear boy. You always loved them," she said, offering him the cookies. Tom thanked her, accepting the plate. Mrs. Williams reminded him to visit her the next day. Tom returned to his bedroom with the cookies, his mind still racing with thoughts of Philip and the haunting guilt that gnawed at him. Sitting on the bed, Tom began to eat, but a sudden, intense burning sensation in his chest interrupted him. He coughed violently, the pain searing through him like molten lava. In a panic, he dropped his plate, the sound of it shattering, piercing the room's silence. Gasping for breath, Tom fell to his knees, his eyes desperately scanning the room. The closet door creaked open, revealing an ominous sight in the semi-darkness. branches emerging from the ajar door. Frozen with terror, Tom watched helplessly as the man with the deer skull for a head slowly emerged from the closet and stood over him. The creature's hands, sharp and icy, gripped him, dragging him towards the closet. Tom's attempts to scream were futile, his voice lost in the engulfing darkness that surrounded him. He felt himself being pulled into an abyss, the closet swallowing him whole into a void of deafening silence and eternal night. As Tom was dragged into the darkness, the last thing he saw was the scattered chunks of potato from his shattered plate, a mundane detail in the midst of the unspeakable horror that had come for him. The darkness enveloped him, a suffocating blanket of terror and despair, pulling him into the depths of a nightmare that had haunted him for 18 long years.